today's webinar. We have a couple of really great guests with us today. We're so privileged to have John Kelly come back with us, Dr. John Kelly, and also a very distinguished guest in Benjamin Fernandez, who's going to talk to us about best practices in crisis response in schools. First of all, we need to look at our agenda for today's presentation. We're going to take a few minutes. Can we look at the next slide? We're going to just have a brief introduction. Obviously, we need to introduce all of the players and who is going to be presenting things today. But above and beyond that, we're going to, hopefully spend the bulk of the time in this presentation. I know it's chock full of content. And if it's going to go a lot like our past webinars, there's so much good stuff. And between that and all of the questions, we run the risk of running over. So I'll try to get through this introduction as quickly as possible. But before we do that, we just need to tell you a little bit about who we are. My name is George Dayton. I work with Illuma on the marketing team. We're a company that's very dedicated to solving problems in special education and mental health. Specifically, we provide services online, related services and mental health supports and therapies. Therapists. We've been doing this for about 10 years. And we have over 300 team members servicing 36 states, and we've served over 29,000 students. For those of you who don't know us or don't follow us, we encourage you to follow us on Twitter at illumasolutions.com. There you can find out a lot of news, find access to a lot of great content, and certainly learn about more webinars like this one. But I want to turn the reins over to John Kelly. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about this webinar series. So if we could look at the next slide.
Well, thank you, George. I think as I've tried to do in each and every one of these webinars is simply say thank you. Thank you to you, George, for being such a great partner in this webinar series, and certainly to Illuma for sponsoring this series of webinars. This is our fourth webinar for this particular series. We are in the midst of planning a second series of webinars, so hang tight and certainly watch for that coming up in March. But tonight is a special presentation. One, because I think that when we think about crisis response and we think about the need to really be prepared and not have to respond in the moment to some type of crisis, for those of us that work in education, we really recognize the value of doing that. And so I'm honored to really introduce a colleague and good friend of mine, Ben Fernandez. Now, Ben, I'm not going to read your bio. You can certainly bring it up on the next slide. But suffice it to say that Ben is truly an expert within the area of crisis preparedness and crisis response. Within the National Association of School Psychologists, Ben is one of our lead experts in the Prepare curriculum. He is one of our lead trainers in that area and has really worked nationally, across the country in terms of working with different school districts to help them develop their crisis preparedness and crisis response plans. I do want to briefly share a personal story, quite honestly, to kick us off. And it was a couple of years ago when, unfortunately, the shooting happened at Marjorie Stone Douglas High School down in Parkland, Florida. And I was honored to be asked to come down after the shooting had occurred to help reintegrate the students, reintegrate the staff back onto campus. And so a week or two after the shooting occurred, I was down there for a good period of time. And prior to going down, Ben was my go-to source. I went to Ben, I talked to Ben about some of the things that I needed to be mindful of, things that I could bring to the table, as once again, I did this work with the students and staff, and then really the community of Parkland, Florida. But what was more important to me than that preparation work that Ben and I did together was being down there, and quite honestly, I would be on campus, I'd be working with the students, the staff, and every evening I would go back to the hotel and I'd be by myself. Now you can only imagine doing that type of crisis response work and sitting in a hotel room all by yourself after doing this work throughout the day. But I really wasn't alone. because every night Ben called me. Ben called to kind of debrief. He called to kind of check in with me. And we just sometimes just talked about different things. We didn't have to necessarily talk about what occurred during the day. But it was that connection and that lifeline that Ben brought to me during this crisis response, which was extremely meaningful. And I tell you that story because I think it's a critical part of our crisis preparedness and crisis response. We never do this work alone. We always do it as part of a team. And so it's my honor and my privilege to introduce my good friend, Ben Fernandez. So Ben, let me turn it to you.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it. All right. So let's dive in to the presentation tonight, best practices in crisis response in schools. So let me just go over some of the objectives of our discussion this evening. The first will be to identify what a crisis is and its potential impact on our, not only our students, but our schools. We'll also talk about and learn about the key components of what's considered best practice crisis preparedness and response. And then lastly, participants will identify best practice resources to aid in comprehensive school safety planning, as well as crisis response. So we have a good discussion ahead of us, and thank you all for being here tonight. So here's what's on deck for tonight. First, we're going to talk about just the definitions. What are we talking about in terms of crisis? And then we're going to talk about our why. Why is this important? Why do we do this? Next, we're going to talk about comprehensive safety planning, as well as the last part. We're going to talk about what to do when a crisis happens, accessing your crisis team. And I think many times people think about, when a crisis happens, we have to respond, we have to respond, we have to respond. Yes, that's very important. But what we're going to talk about also is being ready to respond and being prepared to deliver the interventions and supports that we need to help our students, as well as our staff. Okay. So let's start off with the definition of what a crisis is. If you Google school crisis, you're going to get all sorts of hits. Some will be, the funding crisis. Some will be the literacy crisis or staff crisis, or you name it. But what we're really talking about are these incidents that have a very, have a beginning and a clear end. So we're talking about an acute kind of situations. Now, we do recognize that there are some chronic or much longer term kinds of crisis events, and there definitely is a place for that. But we're looking here specifically at those events that are acute. Okay. And, that includes kind of what we're dealing with a pandemic. It is more of a longer term, but there's a definite beginning. And, hopefully we're going to be moving into a different or a new normal, which will kind of signify the end. But how are we responding to those things? But really, we're talking about the acute, the chronic kinds of crisis events, the work that we do here in terms of responding to crisis can help bridge those students to supports as well. So back to the definition of what a crisis is. It is an event that is extremely negative. There's threats for harm, physically, emotionally, and it's all based, influenced by perception. The other element of a crisis is it's such an event that will leave that individual feeling helpless, feeling powerless, and entrapped. So basically, all their previous coping strategies, problem-solving strategies, at that time feel like they just don't have them anymore. They just don't know what to do. So they're left kind of feeling like, oh my goodness, I'm losing my mind. I don't know what to do, which is then ramping up the impact there. And then also crisis generally occurs suddenly. unexpectedly without warning. And so many times it doesn't allow or provide the opportunity for students or schools to prepare for that impact of a crisis. So, there's a lot of conversation and discussion about, more sudden crises versus gradual. But generally, these are the characteristics that are related to a crisis and how they impact a school. Now, what's interesting, like I said, perception is going to impact what a crisis is to an individual. So what a crisis for me may be different for a crisis for you or another person. It's how we perceive it and a number of other variables and risk factors that come into play. But we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. The other thing to keep in mind is that a crisis has the potential to impact the entire school community. It can impact the entire school community, but it also can impact maybe a single individual, a classroom, a grade level, a building, a cluster within a school district or a whole school district. So crises have those elements to them. The next thing we need to talk about are what are some crisis classifications? What are we dealing with here? Brock and colleagues have identified 6 general types of classifications, and you can see those on the screen: acts of war and or terrorism, violent and or unexpected deaths, threatened death and or injury, human-caused disasters, or natural disasters, or severe non-fatal illness or injury. What's common about all 6 of these is that they're not part of the typical school day, thankfully. And because they're not part of the typical school day, those are the things that, really are impactful. We don't have time to prepare for these. It makes it so unusual that, we're going to respond to that crisis in a particular way. So those are the general classifications. So now, what is our why? Why do we do this? Why is responding to a crisis so important? And so I'm going to start here, and then the next slide will continue. One of the things about students, particularly younger students, is that they're generally more vulnerable populations. So the impact of a crisis on them may be more significant than what we may see with adults. And that's in general, but it also may be more significant for those students with special needs, particularly access and functional needs. So we really need to make sure that we're able to provide support for them. And my next slide is going to talk a little bit more as to specifically why we do that, because as we said, crisis events can impact the entire school or even an entire district. So it's very valuable that we're preparing, focusing, thinking about how we can support students during these situations. The other thing that we need to think about is that schools are very unique. Schools have very unique cultures, very unique populations. There's families and community connected to this. And so, having our own staff, having our educators, our administrators, our school mental health staff knowledgeable about best practice safety planning as well as response is crucial, because we know those populations. We know the community. We know the bell schedule. We know what lunch is. And it's important that educators have a stake in that, because sometimes outside providers, outside responders may not have that understanding. They may be very skilled. I have nothing against that. But we play a huge role in terms of the connectedness to not only our students, but our school community as it relates to best practice crisis response. And again, we're going to be talking a little bit about that more. But here's our real why. So again, our students are why we do this. Our students, because of a crisis being so impactful, it's going to disrupt their education, and it's going to potentially disrupt them in a number of different ways. So when a crisis occurs, learning is disrupted. Students will not be able to really adequately pay attention. If all that emotionality, stress, and anxiety and trauma are going on, you're not going to be able to remember, sit in a classroom and learn. You might be physically there, but you might not be emotionally available for that learning. Long term, if supports and interventions are not provided, the long-term impacts are significant. You can have impacts to attendance and coming to school and engagement. It could exacerbate, pre-existing learning challenges, but it doesn't stop with the learning. The emotional and behavioral impact is significant. Clearly, we'll have some students who struggle with coping. And as a result, with some of the trauma, as we know, there can be some behavioral issues that come out of that, as well as grief and other issues. And then finally, the mental health consequences. There are some incidents that are so significant that, even though it's a smaller percentage of the population that get this level of impact, you can have some really significant mental health consequences, particularly with trauma-associated disorders. So the goal of crisis intervention is to really help those who are impacted by the crisis to get to a place where they can cope and problem solve on their own. We're not there to fix it. We're not there to resolve it. We're there to help them get back on their feet so they can problem solve on their own, and which then takes them back to pre-crisis levels of functioning. Again, it might be a new normal, but they're able to tap into those problem-solving skills, those coping skills, and maybe even learn new ones to help them be stronger as they move forward. So that's really the goal of crisis intervention. The other thing to keep in mind is that best practice crisis intervention starts with preparedness, starts with, are we ready to deliver crisis intervention? So it starts way before a crisis occurs. And what you see on the screen are the 5 mission areas that are referenced by the Virginia Department, or not the Virginia, but the U.S. Department of Education and Department of Homeland Security and FEMA in terms of readiness and preparedness for schools. So it starts with prevention. It involves mitigation, protection, response, and recovery. We will participate in all those levels. Or all those elements, or all those missions in our journey to help keep our schools safe and provide best practice crisis intervention supports and interventions. So now that we've covered the basic assumptions, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how do we get prepared to keep our schools safe, and how do we get prepared to be ready to respond to a crisis? And that starts with comprehensive school safety planning. So for me, when I think about comprehensive school safety planning, and the slide says it here so well, school safety and crisis intervention is an all school responsibility. It's not just me as a school psychologist. It's not just the teacher. It's not just the principal. It's not just the school counselor or the school social worker or the school resource officer or the students or the families. We're all involved in comprehensive school safety, okay? Whoops, let me drop back. Didn't mean to go that far on the slides. So what you see on the screen here are 2 key resources. And these are the resources I mentioned just a few seconds ago in terms of comprehensive school safety. These are the key resources that you can find. I have them linked as resources in the presentation, but to help with comprehensive school safety planning. The one is the role of districts in developing high quality school emergency operations plans. And it's a companion guide to this other document, which is the Guide to Developing High Quality School Emergency Operation Plans. This provides everything you need to know and guides you through the process in comprehensive school safety planning. So I recommend you download that, take a look at these documents, and really think about how you can start implementing that work in your school if you haven't done so already. Another key concept to be thinking about when you're with comprehensive school safety and planning is we really want to balance between physical safety and psychological safety. They're really two sides of the same coin. You don't want to have one kind of overpower the other, because that will kind of disrupt everything, but you really want that nice balance. So here's some examples on the screen you'll see for physical and psychological safety. Obviously we have secure doors. We have single point entry. The doors are locked. There's only one way in. And then with psychological safety, having trusting, respectful relationships. Other examples of physical safety, supervision, and others you can see on the psychological safety side are very important. But the key thing is to have that nice balance of physical and psychological safety. Okay. Some other things that you want to consider in comprehensive school safety, obviously it's a multidisciplinary team that's coming together to think about, okay, what do we need to do for our schools to keep them safe? And not only keep them safe, but when something happens, how are we going to respond? And then how are we going to help recovery so we can get back to a place where our schools are for learning again? Another thing in terms of planning is it is prevention focused, because if we can prevent things from happening, that's actually also a part of best practice response, because that's building strength and resiliency, and folks know that there are supports in place. And these are other things that we want to make sure we're practicing these things regularly, even though they don't happen every day. It's good to have that knowledge, that practice and awareness, so we can empower students and staff to respond and do what they need to do when something happens at a school. And then finally, I think this is so important, is these plans, these procedures, these processes are constantly being reviewed. Look at them, look at your lessons learned, update them, because the goal is to get better and better and better. Because again, we are serving the needs of students. We really want to make sure that we're getting good at what we do, despite the tragedies around it. Other things to keep in mind in terms of planning is we want to be thinking about all those mission areas and how we can be providing work and support in those mission areas. We also want to consider multiple hazards. Yes, it's important that we're focusing on school shootings, but there are a lot of other hazards we need to be considering. COVID, for example, people are dying from COVID. How are we going to respond and take care of, let's say, if a beloved teacher dies of COVID, or the second leading cause of death for youth 10 to 19 is suicide. How are we preparing to respond to those needs? So making sure you're taking a good hard look at your school district and saying, okay, what are some of the hazards and threats to our school that we need to be ready to address and prepare for? Again, we also want to be collaborative. Schools can't do this by themselves. Reaching out to their community partners, law enforcement, community mental health, the medical community, all can come together to help schools be safe. And then finally, we want to have a multi-tiered systems of support to provide these interventions and help for students. Another important thing I really want to stress is that when we're planning, we really want to make sure that we're including all students. I think in the rush for schools to become safe, they're so focused on, okay, how do we, evacuate effectively? And again, I'm not, slamming anybody or judging anybody, but I think in our rush to be safe, we're not always thinking about all the needs of our students, particularly students and staff with special needs. And you can see from the definition here, they're the needs for assistance due to any condition, temporary or permanent, that limits an ability or individual's ability to act. So we really must be thinking about how we're going to support these access and functional needs before, during, and after an incident. So that must be included in our plans as well. Because again, the more we can plan and prepare for, yes, it's going to be very helpful and successful in dealing with the incident, but it's also considered part of best practice crisis response. Okay. So what are some of the functional needs or special needs of students? Obviously, we'll think of students who have physical disabilities or mobility disabilities, but we also need to consider, some mental health conditions, sensory challenges, medical conditions, students and families and staff with limited or non-English speakers. When we're doing our planning, we need to think about how are we going to communicate, how are we going to evacuate, how are we going to lock down, and how are we going to provide psychological recovery services or for these students and staff as well. And again, safety is for all students and staff. Gotta keep that in mind as we move forward. So next, and really what I encourage everyone to do is really dive into some of the resources I've included, because there's just a lot to cover and a lot to think about in terms of safety planning. I ran through that very quickly, but definitely just be mindful that there's just a lot. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, school safety is not an overnight thing. It's a constant process. So, be aware of that. So next, we want to talk about accessing the crisis team when a mental health crisis, utilizing the mental health crisis team for response. And one of the things I should say in terms of a crisis, a lot of things are going to be happening all at once. There'll be your physical safety folks, addressing the variety of needs, and the psychological safety folks, addressing a variety of needs. So a lot of things are happening simultaneously based on some of your plans that have been created. So one of the things, many things we really need to think about is, this is a multidisciplinary team effort. So you rely on your teams to fulfill your roles. And when a crisis happens, staff are going to transition to their day-to-day roles to their crisis team or their crisis roles. So when a crisis happens, we want to activate that team. So depending on the nature of the crisis and the length of the crisis, folks will transition to that. So for example, for me, by day, I'm a school psychologist providing, the variety of mental health and diagnostic supports to my school. But when a crisis occurs, my role changes to a member of the crisis team, specifically a crisis team leader. And so, I'll still do those, but in that moment when I'm responding, I am in my role as a crisis team member and a crisis team leader. So that communication happens. You activate your crisis team, you communicate on many different levels about what's going on to make sure we're responding to the needs of the school and the students. So I'm kind of jumping around my boxes here. But communication, again, there's so many levels to that. Communicating with your crisis team, communicating with your leadership team, communicating amongst your staff, communicating to students, communicating to your school communities. That is another key element to crisis response, because without good, solid communication, one, the efficiency of your response will be disrupted, but two, the rumor mill will start. If we don't get those crisis facts out early and regularly, that void's going to be filled with something else. So I think it's going to be very important that you, in your planning stages, thinking about all the different types of communication that you're going to be utilizing, and maybe even coming up with little templates that you can quickly adapt to meet the needs of your communications in a crisis response. So before you all do all that, you really need to collect and verify the facts. We need to know exactly what's going on. And during a crisis, a lot of information is going to be happening. A lot of things are going to be pushed at you, some factual, some rumor, but rely on your agency and your community partners who will reach out to law enforcement to confirm what is going on. Do you have key staff to do that? And having those verified facts is going to help manage the threat perceptions that are occurring. And that is so key. Making sure you have verified facts. Verify it once, verify it twice, because the last thing you want to do is inadvertently push out inaccurate information. So make sure you verify that multiple times. The next thing you want to make sure is before you even start responding is that students and schools are safe. You want to reaffirm their physical safety and then address perceptions of safety. Because thinking about Maslow, if you're not feeling safe and taking care of those basic needs, how are we going to address some of the other needs, like the psychological needs? So make sure that those are some of the key elements that are being addressed as you're responding. Again, I'm going through this very quickly. There's a lot of great resources I encourage you to take a look at. Go ahead and do that, do some more research after we're done with this conversation, or definitely reach out to me. I'm happy to continue this conversation. So all those kind of foundational or key pieces are kind of squared away. The next thing we want to do is triage and assess the degree of impact. Because what's very, very important is that there is no one size fits all intervention. And another thing we need to be very, very mindful of is with all our interventions, the last thing we want to do is cause more harm than good. So we really need to take a look at who's been impacted and who needs the most need at that time. So this is done in a number of different ways. It's done on kind of the big picture level, looking at, okay, what is the degree of impact? And in determining the degree of impact of the crisis, that will kind of help us identify the need for a response and the size of response. Is it something that the school-based crisis team can manage on their own, or is it so intense that the school-based crisis team is overwhelmed and that they need to bring in the central-based crisis team, or is it that the central-based and the school-based are overwhelmed, and now we're looking at more of a regional crisis response? Another level that we're looking at is the impact of students. We're looking at a number of different variables. We're looking at physical proximity. We're looking at emotional proximity to the actual incident. We're looking at internal variables, internal vulnerabilities. We're looking at external vulnerabilities and how that comes into play. We're trying to understand developmental level as well as cultural influences on how they're experiencing and interpreting a crisis. And from all that helps us kind of dial in our interventions. It helps us to understand the appropriate interventions based on the demonstrated need from the assessment that we've done for those students. And this can happen pretty quickly. And once we have that information, we have intervention tools at our fingertips in the form of tiers of support that can provide helpful interventions to students. And so what you're seeing on the screen, NASP's Prepare curriculum has this tiered systems of supports. And you can see that tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 have different types of interventions. Now, these interventions build upon each other. So, when a crisis happens, depending on the need, you're going to be pushing out tier 1 supports to universally help your students and staff. There are a number of different things I already talked about, reaffirming health and welfare and safety and perceptions of safety. We talked about kind of the evaluating of psychological trauma, but then beyond that, there are things we can do at the universal level. I think many times for families where there's a crisis happen in their schools, they want information on how to help their child. So pushing out informational documents, flyers, websites, pushing helpful information on social media to your families. That's kind of a tier 1 support. Also having specific group training for caregivers, for families, for teachers on what are the typical signs that a student's been impacted by a crisis, normalizing those, because given a crisis, anyone will be impacted by a crisis, but also give them the tools to recognize, okay, this is a behavior, this is a symptom that I should be really concerned about, and where I can get some help. And then finally empower those caregivers with strategies and interventions that they can use to help their child or their student. And we can go through all these interventions, but those are some of the universal ones, tier 1 you can provide. But then moving up the tiers for those students that are more significantly impacted, there are some these additional interventions that can come into play. You may have some students that are so impacted by the crisis that you need to help de-escalate them and stabilize them before you can actually deliver other interventions. And there's a number of ways you can do that. Student psychoeducational groups, teaching them about what are typical crisis responses, when to be concerned, who to get help from, and then helping them take care of themselves. As another really good strategy. Group crisis intervention are for those who are a little bit more impacted, and that involves a little more deeper group crisis kind of processing. And then individual crisis intervention, working one-on-one with students to help them process what's going on and help them get to a place, again, where they're coping and problem solving on their own. These are some just really effective intervention tools. And then when we get to the top of the tier 3, we're looking at students that are the most significantly impacted. And this is generally a very small portion of those impacted, and that they may require psychotherapy, which schools typically do not provide. So it kind of behooves the school mental health folks to be aware of what's considered best practice trauma therapy. So when parents and families are asking, hey, where do I take these? Where do I take my child for help for these interventions or for support? You can educate them at, looking for, trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapies and things like that. The other one is psychological recovery, which can be delivered in school. It's a manualized approach to helping students at this level continue with their recovery. Because again, remember we talked about how the crisis is acute. So when the dust settles from a crisis, these interventions are being used during that acute time period. But once the crisis ends and the crisis team leaves, it doesn't mean that students are all better. There'll be, like I said, that smaller percentage of students that are going to continue to need some supports beyond these initial kind of psychological first aid interventions. And that's where psychological recovery comes in. You can support these students beyond the crisis for a little bit. But again, we're still, sorry about that. We're still triaging. We're still assessing from tier 1 all the way to tier 3 to making sure that students are responding and not falling back into a place where they need additional supports. So that's something we're going to be continually doing. And then the last thing that we want to do is care for the caregiver. I'll tell you, crisis work can really impact you. Sometimes it takes the legs out from underneath you pretty quickly, and other times it just wears you down slowly over time. So it's really important that you create a self-care plan for yourself as a leader, identifying, when to take care of yourself and how you're going to do that. Identifying your go-tos. Who are your go-to people at school? Who are your go-to people outside of work? And all these other self-care strategies in order to take care of yourself. And the other thing is you want to make sure you're taking care of your team. So doing before a crisis happens, getting to know your team, connecting with them, training with them, and establishing this atmosphere of, what, if this crisis hits too close to home, I'm going to tap out. No harm, no foul, no nothing. You can step away from this if this hits too close to home. And so getting to know your team, it's also recognizing that everyone has some form of loss history and some have some trauma history that we need to recognize in our crisis work. During a crisis, constantly checking on your team. As a crisis team leader, I'm checking in on my team members to making sure they're okay, making sure that we're rotating them out if they're in too long, or if they need breaks, if they need to eat, or if sometimes even though they say they're okay, sometimes the incident does hit close to home. I think a good example of that for me is my dad. Even though he passed away about 14 years ago, sometimes if it's the death of a parent, I can feel it. So, but my team is watching me too, making sure I'm okay. And if there's a point where they think I'm not doing okay, they will step into my leadership role and pull me aside to take care of me. And that's the same thing I'll do for them. So really, focusing on self-care there. And then finally afterwards, that debrief, checking in on each other. How are you doing? Are you doing okay? You can do that as a group or do that individually or both, and remind them of their self-care plans. So here are some resources. I know we went through this pretty quickly. Here are some resources that I talked about. Definitely check out these two resources in terms of, when you're thinking about planning. The Prepare curriculum is a fantastic resource for, crisis teams and psychological recovery. And Safe and Sound Schools has a tremendous amount of great resources. And particularly when it comes to special needs populations, they have a particular curriculum called Especially Safe. And they actually have a free webinar coming up on February 11th. So definitely check that out. There's just really a lot of great information that this group puts out, and they're a really solid group. And so here's some additional resources about drills, active shooter. The I Love You Guys Foundation can provide a lot of great information about evacuations. NASA crisis resources, is tremendous. REMS-TA, that's where the high quality school safety plans come from. I mentioned Safe and Sound Schools. And then After Suicide Toolkit is great as well. So I guess we've come to the end. I think our agenda is, what kind of questions can I answer for folks?
Well, first, let me thank you, Ben. Certainly for all of that information. I think what's important for us to recognize as educators, because I do want to acknowledge we have a variety of educators in the audience tonight, not just mental health professionals, but I really want to kind of reinforce your message of this is a team type of approach. It's a school-wide type of approach. It's not just one individual's or particular mental health professionals, their responsibility. I think that this is something that truly schools need to embrace. And I love your point about the preparedness. And I know I kind of mentioned it in my introductory remarks at the beginning, but that sense of being prepared. Anyone who has experienced any type of crisis, type of event, knows that you don't want to be kind of creating that, or building the airplane in the midst of a crisis. And I think that the preparedness is really probably more important because the response really flows from that. Can you comment just briefly a little bit more on that sense, of preparedness and really the vital role of schools being prepared?
Yeah, I think it really starts with, asking yourself, where is, school safety? Where is your planning? Is it on the front burner? Is it on the side burner or the back burner? And really, thinking about, okay, if students are going to be successful and thrive in school, we have to address not only their academic needs, but their safety needs as well. And so, being prepared and ready to address whatever threats, hazards, crises come your way, that is going to help, schools recover. And I think one of the things that we're really learning from this pandemic is the concept of continuity. When we transitioned, from in person to all of a sudden distance learning because of the pandemic, there was that gap. A lot of schools were not ready for that. And trying to figure out, how are we going to provide academics? How are we going to provide that safety net we used to have in person in the brick and mortar with all the mental health supports that we had? And so really, as you said, John, we were figuring it out as we were going many times. But if we take the time to prepare and think about, okay, what do we need to do if a crisis occurs? What do we need to do if there's an earthquake that destroys a building or a tornado that destroys a building? One, how are we going to prepare to move kids to a different building so they could continue to learn? And then how are we going to provide those mental health supports? So really, preparation is as valuable to crisis response and recovery as the actual response itself. So really thinking about that ahead of time. And it's not getting a mindset of paranoia or anything like that. It's really thinking about, okay, what do we need to do to keep things running and help students get to a point where they're problem solving on their own, they're coping on their own, as well as our staff. And so I think preparedness and prevention are so vitally important, because that helps kind of build that foundational piece of resiliency and readiness for when an actual crisis does happen. We can respond, and that disruption hopefully is not as significant as it would have been if we were not ready for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And I think that as I think about the preparedness, I think one of the major factors, or kind of one of the major components of preparedness is, I guess, what I'll call delineation of roles. When we have a crisis event, everyone can't be doing the same thing. Everyone can't be, there with students or responding directly. And when I've experienced, crisis events in my own profession and in my own school, that delineation of role has been critical. Can you speak to that a little bit, Ben? Because again, we have a variety of different educators, on the call tonight. So I'm just wondering that piece.
Yeah, everyone, like I said, everyone has a role in comprehensive school safety and crisis intervention. Everyone, from the custodial staff to the bus drivers to the building administrators and school leadership. I've always said that principals have not only just an incredible role during a crisis, but there's a lot of weight on their shoulders, but they can really provide that leadership that everyone can look to, the students, the staff, the community to look to help get them through the crisis by leading and being an effective leader during that crisis, being that spokesperson if they have to communicate. I've worked with many principals that have just done amazing things. One in particular I think about, he was actually retired, but was asked to come back and fill in for this principal who died of cancer. And she was an extremely popular principal. The staff loved her, the kids loved her, the community loved her. And he led that community, students, staff, and families through that whole crisis. Our crisis teams were there involved as well, but how he led them really kind of dictated the response in a really positive way. He was really able to speak to them and provide the facts and give them permission to say, hey, you know what? If you're grieving, it's okay. Here's where you can get some help, and really provided just tremendous leadership on that. Teachers have an incredible role as well. They know their students know them, and these educators will know when something is off. So sometimes, at the high school, sometimes students won't really talk about how they're feeling. Sometimes they will, but teachers will know, oh, that student's different today. Let me check in on them. Let me connect. And then, you know what, something is going on. Let me help you connect to some of the crisis team members. So everyone has a role, and families as well. If we empower the families, they can contribute to the recovery of the school, and students too. I've had students who, when they've seen some, during a crisis, there was the rumor mill was going, particularly on social media, and we had shared the facts. And I've seen students try to say, hey, look, that is actually a rumor. These are the facts that we were given. Let's think about the family. Let's be respectful of the family. Here's where you can get some help. And so they've really stepped up in their role as as students, not only to help the family recover, but help their peers recover. So it's really cool to see all these people come together to respond to a crisis. And the school's role in helping families recover is just amazing. I've seen so many different ways schools have provided support to families, touching their grief and helping them kind of recover and walk that grief with them. It's really incredible. So everyone has a role in that.
Yeah, again, I love how you kind of portray that, Ben. One of my I don't want to say favorite stories, because it was connected, unfortunately, with a tragic event that happened in my school regarding loss of a student. And while we were in the midst of responding, and we had different levels of support, kind of similar to what you had talked about in terms of the different tiers of support for students, and a lot of folks were engaged in the direct response. I had one particular administrator who wanted to really support and be part of the process, but knew that he didn't have the expertise necessarily to provide that direct response to that direct intervention for students or other staff members. And so he simply went out and he got food for the response team. He made sure that we were taken care of. And I think back to that, and and it sounds so simple, it sounds almost silly at times, but the reality is that was important for us.
Yes.
We were engaged in this intensive work with our students and staff regarding, again, the loss of this student, and yet to have that ability to go off and grab a sandwich, grab something that this administrator went out and got for us. So I think the delineation of roles just becomes so important.
Yeah, and John, that example is actually a tier one kind of intervention. I don't think I addressed it as when we went over the tiers, but that's connecting folks or providing social support. And providing social support is, as we know, the oldest and most powerful intervention there is when it comes to a crisis. This has been there long before any crisis response or emergency management model. Because when I think back to as a kid, if something happened in town, I grew up in a small town in Western New York, what was the first thing we did? We all rallied around the family and brought a meal. We checked, hey, do we need to help get your kids to school? Things like that. Those are very powerful things. And there's so many different levels to social support, but that is such an incredibly powerful intervention. And John, I know you talk about how you remember that is very impactful as well. I've seen schools do that for schools as well, knowing that, one high school in a neighboring cluster sees the other school going through, significant time. They provided coffee for the teacher. So it's very powerful. There's so many different things to help facilitate recovery of students in schools. It's really neat to see it all. Unfortunately, I hate that the tragedy has to happen, but it's really cool to see things come into play to help the recovery after that.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I have a couple questions from the audience, but George, I wanted to see if you had any questions that maybe came through on your end or that you want to pose to Ben.
Probably not so much in the form of questions, but just I have a comment myself. As we discussed beforehand, I had a niece that was there at Parkland, and I think one of the silver linings in a tragedy such as this is that we have people like yourself, Ben and John, that can come in and really take care of these kids. I mean, the potential for lifetime impact of this kind of trauma is immense, and to have experts like yourself who are prepared to come in and alleviate that and really reduce the impact of that trauma says a lot. And fortunately, we're in a place in this country. Unfortunately, we're having these kinds of traumas, but the flip side of it is that with each subsequent one, we're becoming increasingly prepared. And I just want to express my gratitude to the both of you and all of the folks out there that are really making a difference, and whether it's a school shooting or whether it's something like, a pandemic, or whether it's something, more specific to an individual like a suicide or a tragedy. I've seen, here in Utah, we've had, sometimes, our kids get in catastrophic car accidents, and you'll see a number of students, taken away from us. And it's powerful when we know that we have an apparatus in place, that we have the know-how, and we have the individuals that can come in and help our kids, because again, the impact of all of these kinds of things are profound.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I appreciate that, George. And Ben, I think that one of the things that, I think about when we talk about crisis preparedness and crisis response is a lot of times we focus on these major events, these big events, school shootings or some type of, tragic loss within the community. But the reality is that crisis events occur on a daily basis within the schools. And so our crisis preparedness and our crisis response, yes, while it's very important and critical for these large events, could you comment just on the crisis preparedness that we need just almost on a daily basis within the school?
Mm-hmm. I really think it starts with knowing your team. Who is your team that's going to be responding, and that may look differently, from school to school. Some schools that have a lot of resources versus some that don't have a lot of resources, from urban to suburban to rural. Who is on your team? And again, like I said, that'll look differently, but who is your team that will be able to respond to these crises? And, like with I work for a decent size school district in Northern Virginia, and we have a lot of staff. But there are parts of Virginia where they're very rural, and there's maybe one school psychologist and a handful of school counselors. And so when something big happens, they have to, they have agreements with their neighboring districts to say, okay, when something happens, hey, can you help us out? And they bring their staff here. So really, again, thinking about that preparedness, thinking, maybe kind of outside the box on, okay, if something happens, how are we going to address those needs? And I think the other thing is just having that mindset of, we want to keep getting better and better at what we do, because we're here to support the needs of the students, and crises aren't going away. I've been practicing about 25 years now, and it's like every year my crisis team will have to go out to do something, or my building level team is responding to something. It's really kind of making sure that you learn from each response to get better and better, and really keeping your training and your knowledge and that collaboration going, because all those things will help you be a stronger team and help you be ready to deal with whatever's coming your way. And knowing when to say, okay, I need help from some other people. Those would be some of the things I think in terms of readiness and preparedness that need to be in place. And just kind of thinking about, okay, what do I need to do to support the children? Really just boiling it down to that essential element. What is the best way we can support our students?
No, I love that. Thank you, Ben. I think we have time for probably one more question. I think one comment that I want to offer to kind of highlight something that you said just a moment ago, Ben, when you were talking about self-care. And once again, for those of us that are engaged in the direct response to crisis events, I know we were chatting a little bit before we went live here on the webinar about the reality is sometimes we do experience secondary trauma, and this work is very, very difficult work. And I love the point that you made about tapping out, and sometimes it's personal. I know you shared about your dad, and how that is difficult for you sometimes when that's the crisis event that you're dealing with. And I think we all need to know our limits, and it's okay for us to know where our limits are as crisis responders. So I just want to kind of reinforce that point. I know that I've learned that personally, in my work, and I think it's just so critical for any crisis team member to really know, where some of those personal touch points really are, and kind of honor that within ourselves. Absolutely. But to kind of pose one more question to you, our good friend Peter, was talking about the pandemic and the prolonged nature of the pandemic, and he kind of referred back to the slide where you were talking about the sequence of events from prevention to mitigation, protection, response, and recovery, and really how when we have these prolonged events, how it's very difficult to kind of go through a sequence. So I just wanted to kind of ask if you had any thoughts about when you have a crisis event, such as a pandemic or some type of prolonged event, words of wisdom in terms of our response to that.
Oh, that's almost $1 million question there, John. But we're all living it, and I think for me, it's really, taking a hard look at my school, knowing my students, knowing my families, and saying, okay, what, and that constant triage, that constant assessment of the impact of a crisis, because things are going to ebb and flow. Recovery is going to ebb and flow. And making sure I have an understanding of, okay, are students getting to a point where they're starting to cope on their own, or are some other challenges kind of emerging? Because I think we're going to feel this for a while. And I think, in some respects, I wonder if, during the closures, that was one thing that seems to have changed. Now we're moving into this new world. And so in a sense, the triaging is continuing, but our perspectives are changing and being focused on what is the long-term recovery going to be, not only just from a psychological standpoint, but from that academic standpoint and things like that. So I think being in it for the long haul, and constantly, checking on yourself and your teams, and your schools to see how they're doing, particularly the teachers, because they're shouldering a lot as well. And I think you can apply that kind of thinking to any kind of major natural disaster, because, tornadoes and flooding, and maybe even using the examples of the California wildfires, the recovery for that is still going on for a lot of these communities. So it's thinking about the long haul, assessing and triaging, and doing the best to provide the supports and bringing in additional help when needed. I don't know if I have an easy answer for that, but for me, I'm looking at my school, looking at my students, saying this is going to be a long haul. This is going to be a long response, and how are we going to try to meet the needs of these students and families the best we can?
No, I think that's a great way to kind of close for this evening, is to recognize that, crisis preparedness, crisis response is a process. And sometimes that process takes time. And sometimes the issues are resolved quicker. And other times we're really looking at prolonged action, depending upon the nature of the crisis itself. So let me thank you, Ben, for all of your time, your expertise this evening. We're thrilled to have you here. Just to remind folks, we will be sending out the slide deck for you after this presentation, with all the resources that Ben has provided within the slides themselves. So
yeah, Ben, that was truly amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, George. Thanks, John, for the opportunity. I know this sounds crazy, but I absolutely love crisis work. So I just really enjoy talking about it and helping others with it. So thank you again for inviting me. This was really special. So thank you.
Well, we benefit from your expertise. So thank you, Ben.